The sky above Arizona cracked open like a rotten egg, not with thunder or lightning, but with searing streaks of light that split the dusk into ribbons of fire. The desert, usually immune to drama, stood silent as a half-dozen fireballs roared across the horizon. Patrick Corman lowered his welding mask and stared at the sky from the roof of his trailer. He'd been patching a hole in the water tank with a strip of aluminum siding when the first meteor flashed over the ridge. Now he just stood there, squinting. "Not supposed to be any showers tonight," he muttered. The radio inside his trailer was still playing an old country tune. He climbed down the ladder, boots crunching on gravel, and ducked inside. "Repeat, this is not a drill. Multiple objects entering Earth's atmosphere." Impact locations not yet confirmed. Patrick turned the volume up. His brow furrowed as he stared at the old crank radio. The voice was clear, clipped, military. He grabbed his phone, no signal, satellite internet. Nothing. Power still running, barely. He glanced out the window. The lights on the horizon were now gone, but there were faint plumes of smoke rising out near the Black Mesa. When the knock came at the door, it wasn't hurried. Just 3 firm knocks. Patrick opened it and immediately wished he hadn't. The creature on his front steps was tall, maybe 7 feet, with a narrow frame wrapped in a faded metallic robe that shimmered like oil on water. Its skin was smooth, almost rubbery, a dull shade of blue-gray. 2 large black eyes blinked slowly at him. Patrick didn't move. The alien tilted its head and said in a clipped but clear voice, "Emergency. I require shelter. Your world is under imminent threat." Patrick blinked. "You speak English?" "No, my translator does." "Okay, sure, that makes it better." The alien stepped forward onto the doormat. "I am not hostile. I am designated Recon Unit Vesh. My ship has been destroyed by the meteor event. I repeat, your world is under threat." Patrick stepped aside hesitantly. "You want to come in or just keep repeating that?" Vesh entered, ducking slightly. Patrick's living room was cluttered radio parts, tools, old computer monitors, and the remains of a half-eaten burrito on the counter. The alien ignored all of it. "I detected the meteor shower before entering orbit," Vesh said. "I attempted to deploy countermeasures. They failed. This was not a natural event." Patrick grabbed a chair and sat, his welding gloves still on. "You're saying someone threw rocks at Earth, not rocks. Comet fragments guided. Someone or something weaponized them." Patrick rubbed his face. "Great. And we're just sitting ducks. Unless you have subterranean protection or orbital defense systems, yes." Patrick gave a dry laugh. "You're in a trailer in the desert, buddy. I've got an old generator, some tools, and a fridge that only works if you kick it twice." Vesh turned, eyes scanning the room. "You have welding equipment, metal stockpiles, salvaged electronics. You can build." Patrick looked at him. "You want me to build a bunker in a few days?" "You nuts. You misunderstand. I do not expect you to build alone. I will assist. We must begin immediately." Patrick stood and walked over to the window. The sky was darker now, but not because of the sun. Smoke and dust were beginning to haze out the stars. "All right," he said. "You want a shelter underground. We'll need to dig. We'll need supports, ventilation, power. You're gonna have to get your hands dirty." "My hands are adaptable," Patrick snorted. "I'll bet." They started by clearing out the backlot behind the trailer. Patrick had enough scrap lumber and rusted steel pipes to build a frame. Vesh helped by lifting heavy beams with surprising ease. Patrick taught him to use a sawzall, and Vesh adapted in seconds. "You learn fast," Patrick said, wiping sweat from his face. "I was designed for adaptive field engineering. Convenient." By the second day, they dug a trench 10 feet deep. Patrick had a backhoe barely functional, and Vesh kept it running by jury rigging parts from a broken microwave. They reinforced the walls with salvaged pallets and steel braces from old bed frames. At night, Patrick tried to sleep. The meteor storm hadn't stopped. Sometimes he'd hear distant booms, and once the power flickered from a shockwave. On the third day, Patrick twisted his ankle stepping into the trench. He yelped, fell, and landed hard on his side. Vesh was there in seconds. "Are you injured?" "Ankle. Hurts like hell." Vesh scanned it with a small device from his belt. "Bone is not broken. Ligament strain." "You must rest." "I've got no time for rest." "You will delay us more if you collapse. Sit." Patrick grumbled but obeyed. Vesh applied a cold compress made from a salvaged car AC unit and a gel he synthesized from desert plants. "You do that often?" Patrick asked. "Repurpose materials." "Constantly." By the 5th day, they had a basic chamber framed and covered with old sheet metal. Patrick had rerouted power from his generator and installed lights inside. It was crude but functional. That night, Vesh stood outside, staring at the sky. Patrick joined him, limping slightly. "You miss your people." "There is no one to miss," Vesh said. "My kind are not communal. We are deployed alone, built for isolation." Patrick handed him a beer. "Well, that's depressing." Vesh turned the can over in his hands. "Is this nourishment?" "Debatable." They stood quietly for a while, the stars flickering through the veil of smoke. On day 7, the first of the larger impacts hit within 50 miles. The ground shook. Dust poured from the sky like rain. Patrick's solar panels were buried. A shockwave cracked the windows of the trailer. The hideout held. Patrick and Vesh hunkered inside, listening to the thunder of the world being pelted from above. The chamber was small, just enough to sleep and store supplies. There was a crude ventilation system made from old ductwork and a fan powered by a car battery. They stayed underground for 12 hours. Patrick's back ached from sleeping on concrete. Vesh didn't seem to sleep at all. When they emerged, the landscape looked different. Trees had blackened. The air smelled of sulfur. The trailer was still standing, but one wall had buckled. Patrick stood in silence. Vesh looked at him. "We should not remain above ground, I know." They reinforced the hideout, added a second chamber for food and water. Patrick used old water tanks and buried them vertically. Vesh scavenged solar cells from a crashed vehicle 5 miles away and brought back a melted satellite dish. Patrick asked, "You think this'll last?" Vesh paused. "Not indefinitely." "But long enough." "Long enough for what? For others to arrive or decide not to?" Patrick didn't like the sound of that, but he kept working. By day 10, Patrick had a limp, a bad cough from the ash, and a burn on his left arm from a battery short. Vesh treated it with antiseptic paste made from cactus sap. "You should rest more," Vesh said, "and let you build crooked shelves without me." "Not a chance." The days blurred. By day 14, they had reinforced the hideout with a third chamber. Patrick had even installed a crude air filter using charcoal and canvas. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Then came the second storm, worse than before. Larger impacts, closer. Inside the hideout, the walls shook. Dirt cascaded from the ceiling. Patrick pressed his hand against a beam and felt the vibration hum through his bones. He looked at Vesh. "If this place collapses..." "It won't. I calculated the stress loads. You better be right." They waited. When the storm passed, the exit was blocked. Patrick looked up at the hatch, now jammed with debris. "Guess we're digging out." Vesh began disassembling one of the wall supports. "We will need to reinforce the tunnel as we go." Patrick nodded. "I'll get the shovels." It took them 6 hours to dig. Patrick's arm throbbed. His ankle flared with pain every time he shifted weight, but they pushed through. When they emerged, the world was quiet. The desert looked like a war zone. Craters smoked in the distance. The trailer was gone. Patrick knelt in the dust. "Damn." Vesh stood beside him, unmoving. Patrick wiped his face. "We need to find others. There's got to be someone out there." Vesh nodded once. "Then we will go, but we take the shelter with us. It may be needed again." Patrick looked at the hideout's hatch, half buried in dust. "We built that from junk." "Yes." "And it saved us." Patrick stood, groaning. "Then we better find more junk." They packed what they could: tools, batteries, food, and began walking toward the nearest town, hoping the hideout would remain, ready for whoever needed it next. By the time they reached the outskirts of Holbrook, the wind had picked up enough to sting their faces with fine grit. Patrick pulled the collar of his jacket tighter around his throat and shielded his eyes with a cracked pair of welding goggles. Vesh didn't flinch. His outer layer had shifted tone since morning. Where it had once shimmered faintly, it now looked matte and dust-caked, like a burned rubber mat. "Do your people not design for comfort?" Patrick asked, trudging past a toppled mailbox. "We design for function." "Comfort is an indulgence. Tell that to my spine." They passed what used to be a gas station. The canopy had collapsed inward, and the pumps were half melted, their hoses shriveled and black. A scorched sedan sat nearby with its tires melted into the pavement. Nothing stirred. No birds, no distant engines, not even the buzz of power lines. Doesn't feel like anyone's left, Patrick said. There are power signatures below the surface, geothermal fluctuations, possibly survivors underground. Patrick stopped walking. Bunkers or shielded facilities. Hard to tell at this range. He glanced toward the center of town. A few rooftops poked out, but most of the buildings had either collapsed or been buried by debris. In the distance, a grain silo leaned precariously to one side, half its panels missing. They moved toward a collapsed hardware store. Patrick stepped over a shattered window frame and ducked beneath a bent steel beam. Inside, it smelled of burnt wood and wet concrete. Shelves had fallen like dominoes, and broken tools littered the floor like discarded toys. "Anything usable?" Vesh asked, scanning the wreckage with a handheld device. "Maybe. If we can find a pry bar and something to carry supplies, I can grab wire fasteners. Maybe even a propane tank if it didn't rupture." Vesh moved toward the back wall, where a half-collapsed shelving unit was buried in drywall fragments. He lifted one end with a grunt. Patrick slipped in and began pulling items from the debris spool of copper wire, unbroken LED bulbs, a box of heavy-duty gloves still in plastic wrap. "Watch it," Patrick warned, as a metal bracket clattered down beside him. "I will not allow structural failure to occur while you are within. I appreciate the loyalty, RoboCop, but my skull's not rated for falling shelves." By mid-afternoon, the two had packed what they could into an old rolling cart they'd found wedged under a refrigerator display. The wheels squealed with every turn, but it held. They followed the remains of a residential street, where fences had been reduced to tangled wire and mailboxes hung from their posts like broken arms. Patrick paused in front of a half-standing house with faded blue siding and a shattered satellite dish on the roof. "Used to be a friend of mine lived here," he muttered. Vesh didn't respond. A low rumble rolled across the horizon. Patrick turned, squinting into the sky. A thick column of smoke rose far to the west, too dark for fire, too slow for a jet. "Another impact?" Patrick asked. "No, a vessel, not ours." Patrick's fingers tightened around the cart handle. "Hostile? Unknown, but it's descending manually. Controlled re-entry. Then we better not be standing out in the open like lawn ornaments." They abandoned the cart behind a cinderblock wall and moved downhill into a culvert thick with weeds and gravel. Patrick crouched behind a rusted-out pickup truck while Vesh climbed onto the bed to get a better view. The object broke through the upper atmosphere with no sonic boom, just a low whine that made Patrick's molars hum. It was long and narrow, like a flattened spindle, and trailed a ribbon of vapor behind it. As it neared the ground, a series of small jets fired along its belly, slowing its descent until it vanished behind a ridge. "Touchdown," Vesh said. "Which direction?" "Southwest." "Approximately 6 kilometers. Then we go southwest." The sun dropped lower, casting long shadows across the ruined town. They walked in silence, cutting through alleys and dry creek beds until the ground began to slope upward again. As they climbed, Patrick's leg began to throb. The ache sharpened with each step until he finally dropped to one knee near a bent guardrail. Vesh stopped and turned. "You're in pain. No kidding. Your gait has been compensating for instability. You've worsened the injury. Tape it and move on." "I'm not slowing us down." Vesh knelt and opened a pouch on his belt. From it, he pulled a thin roll of metallic mesh and a small vial of clear liquid. "What is that?" "Support weave. It hardens when activated. Will stabilize the joint." Patrick winced as Vesh wrapped it around his ankle, then poured a few drops of the liquid over it. The mesh stiffened instantly, locking his foot in place like a brace. "Feels like I stuck my foot in a car jack. You'll be able to walk. But avoid sudden impacts." "I'll keep that in mind, Doc." They reached the ridge just before dusk. The air cooled rapidly, and a few stars began to pierce through the haze. Below them, in a flat stretch of desert, the object had landed. It wasn't a ship. Not exactly. More like a modular pod, covered in hexagonal plates and supported by 4 insect-like legs that had drilled themselves into the ground. A hatch was half open, and pale light spilled out. Around it, 5 figures moved in slow, deliberate movements. Patrick ducked low. They look like you. No, friends, I doubt it. Each of the figures wore a long, segmented suit with rigid spines along the back. Their heads were encased in full helmets, and each carried a long device resembling a lance. One of them stopped and looked directly toward the ridge. Down, Vesh said. Patrick dropped flat against the gravel. You think they saw us? They scanned this area. Passive sweep. Can they track us? Possibly. Wonderful. Vesh reached into his satchel and pulled out a small disc. He placed it on a flat rock and tapped it twice. It began to glow faintly. Short-range interference field will mask our biosignatures for a limited time. How limited? 20 minutes. Patrick nodded. Then we don't have long to learn what they're doing. They circled downwind, keeping low, using wreckage and dry brush for cover. As they neared the pod, the figures began to unload equipment canisters, relay spikes, something that looked like a folded antennae array. They're setting up a beacon, Vesh whispered, for communication or targeting. Patrick studied the figures. I count 5. No visible eyes, no vocal exchange. They move like machines. They are not autonomous, but heavily augmented. Can we disable the beacon? Not without drawing fire. Patrick reached into his jacket and pulled out a small case. Inside were 3 homemade charges, each no bigger than a deck of cards. Salvaged from a heating unit, he said. Won't vaporize anything, but they'll short out electronics in a 10-foot radius. Vesh looked at them. Crude, but effective. They waited until the figures moved behind the pod, then crept forward. Patrick planted the first charge beneath the relay array, then another near the base of the beacon tower. Just as he reached for the last, a low, chittering sound vibrated through the ground. One of the figures had returned. Patrick froze. The figure tilted its head, then raised its lance. A beam of pale blue light swept over the area. Vesh sprang from the shadows, slamming into the figure's side with enough force to send it sprawling. It rolled once, then sprang back to its feet unnaturally fast. Patrick dove for the last charge, slammed it into place, and hit the trigger. A burst of static erupted around them. The beacon flickered and died. The figure stumbled, its lance sputtering. Run, Patrick shouted. They bolted away from the pod as alarms began to wail. The other figures gave chase, but the interference field still held. By the time the enemy reached the ridge, Patrick and Vesh were gone, swallowed by darkness. They didn't stop running until the lights of the pod were distant flickers. Only then did Patrick collapse behind a fallen billboard, panting hard. We just poked a hornet's nest, he said. Yes, Vesh replied, but now we know they're vulnerable. Patrick looked up at the stars, which were slowly returning through the haze. Let's hope we're not the only ones who noticed. They reached the edge of the dry riverbed just after dawn, with the sun dragging itself over the hills like it didn't want to be up either. Patrick's brace-locked ankle had swollen enough to make every footstep feel like walking on a brick. He leaned against a toppled stop sign and unwrapped a protein bar that had fused with its wrapper sometime last year. This expired 6 years ago, he muttered. Vesh took it from his hand and sniffed it. The fat content has separated, but it is still caloric. Perfect. Breakfast of questionable champions. They sat in the shadow of a twisted billboard that once advertised motor oil and now looked like a monument to poor structural engineering. Vesh tore apart the protein bar and examined the interior like a jeweler inspecting a counterfeit diamond. Why do you ingest substances with uncertain chemical stability? He asked. Patrick chewed. Because the vending machines are all on fire and I'm not picky. Vesh didn't eat, just watched the horizon. The pod and its insect-limbed occupants were long behind them, but it wasn't distance that kept Vesh on alert, it was probability. You think they'll track us? Patrick asked. They were deploying a beacon. If it transmitted before we disrupted it, then others will come. If not, they will search manually. So either way, we're not exactly off the grid. Your planet has very few places left that could be considered hidden. Patrick shifted, wincing as his ankle pressed against the brace. I need to reset this. The swelling's pushing against the wrap. Vesh nodded. You will need to release pressure slowly. If you remove it all at once, the tissue will expand too rapidly and increase the damage. Patrick leaned back, unbuckled the top strap, and hissed as the tension eased. His sock was damp with sweat and slightly darker around the heel. Bleeding? Vesh asked. No, just fluid, probably some microtears. I've had worse. He peeled the sock off carefully, revealing an ankle bloated and blotchy with purple and red. Vesh scanned it, then pulled out a narrow rod with a small loop on the end. Circulation is restricted. I will relieve the pressure. Hold still. Patrick gripped a rock with one hand and muttered something unprintable as Vesh inserted the loop under the edge of the skin and made a small puncture. A thin line of clear fluid dribbled out. That was way too calm for stabbing me, Patrick muttered. The tension is reduced. You will regain better mobility in 6 hours, but the joint is structurally compromised. You must avoid uneven surfaces. Great. We're in Arizona. They rested another hour before moving again, following the riverbed south where cracked irrigation pipes jutted out like broken bones. Around mid-morning, they spotted movement near a collapsed overpass. Patrick froze. People? No, Vesh said. Not humans. 4 beings moved with mechanical precision, each with a long, narrow frame and iridescent armor that shimmered like fish scales. They weren't the same as the pod crew. These had visible mouths, wide and lipless, and their eyes were covered with angular visors. They're not searching, Patrick said. They're collecting. The newcomers were scanning debris with handheld devices and digging through the rubble with clawed gloves. One of them pulled a chunk of twisted metal from the wreckage and slotted it into a pack on its back. They're salvaging, Vesh confirmed, scavengers, possibly, or data harvesters. That piece was from a satellite dish. It may contain stored transmissions. Patrick crouched lower, ankle throbbing, and stared. You think they're hostile. They haven't noticed us. But they are not native to this region. Their environmental suits are adapted for dry atmospheres. They likely arrived independently of the impact events. Great, third-party looters. As they watched, one of the aliens turned directly toward them. Vesh pressed a hand to Patrick's shoulder. Don't move, he whispered. The alien took 3 slow steps forward, visor gleaming in the sun. Then it paused, scanned the area briefly, and turned back to rejoin the others. Either they didn't see us, Patrick said, exhaling, or they didn't care. Neither is reassuring. They waited until the group moved out of sight, then crossed the overpass remains and continued toward the hills. The terrain grew more uneven, and Patrick used a scavenged curtain rod as a walking stick. Around midday, they spotted a slab of concrete half buried in dust, marked with faded hazard symbols. Patrick tapped the side with his boot. Utility entrance, likely an old stormwater control station, Vesh said. It may connect to subterranean infrastructure. They found a rusted hatch tucked beneath an overgrown bush and pried it open. The metal groaned but gave way, and a waft of stale air rolled out. Smells like a gym bag married a sewer, Patrick muttered. Airborne pathogens are minimal. Mold spores, mostly. They climbed down a narrow ladder into a concrete tunnel lined with aging pipes and flickering lights that hadn't seen real power in years. Patrick's headlamp cut a narrow beam through the gloom. After a few hundred feet, they reached a junction chamber where the ceiling had partially collapsed. A small generator sat in the corner, silent. Nearby, a water barrel and a handful of sealed food tins sat on a shelf. Someone used this, Patrick said, temporarily. No signs of recent habitation. Perhaps another survivor passed through. Patrick checked the tins. Pineapple slices, probably from the last century. They ate without speaking. Vesh, having no need for food, examined the generator and managed to coax a few minutes of power from it long enough to charge Patrick's radio. Still no signal, Patrick muttered. Either every tower's down or no one's left to broadcast. You may be the last human in this region. That's not the good kind of record. They stayed underground through the afternoon. Patrick elevated his ankle on a crate and used an old towel as a makeshift compression wrap. Vesh built a crude motion alarm from a proximity sensor and a handheld mirror, placing it near the hatch. When dusk fell, they ventured out again. The sky was streaked with greenish clouds and the air buzzed faintly, as though lightning hung just out of reach. They reached the top of a nearby ridge where an old ranger tower still stood, battered but upright. Patrick limped up the stairs one at a time while Vesh climbed silently behind him. At the top, they could see for miles scarred deserts stretching in every direction. Smoke still rose in thin columns on the horizon, and the land bore new scars as if clawed by a giant. Patrick sat on the edge, legs dangling. So, we're still breathing. What now? Vesh joined him, scanning the distance. I have transmitted a low-frequency signal. My people will detect it eventually, if they have not already. And if they don't, then we continue. You adapt, I assist. Patrick exhaled through his nose. You know, I built that shelter thinking I'd wait it out, maybe a few weeks tops. Figured FEMA would roll in, or the military. They may have been overwhelmed or destroyed. Patrick tilted his head back and laughed once. That's the problem with humans, we always assume someone's in charge. Vesh glanced at him. And yet you survived, barely. You built defenses. Repaired technology, created functional equipment from refuse. You adapted to alien threats. That is not barely, that is exceptional. Patrick looked out over the broken land, the wind tugging at his collar. I didn't do it because I thought I'd win. I did it because I didn't want to lose sitting down. Vesh nodded slowly, a gesture he'd picked up from watching Patrick. There is value in that. They spent the night in the tower. Patrick slept for the first time in 2 days, his foot propped up, the pain dulled by exhaustion. Vesh kept watch, his eyes scanning the darkness, alert for movement. By morning, the wind had shifted. A high-pitched tone pulsed faintly from Vesh's scanner. Response signal, he said. My people received the transmission. Patrick sat up, blinking. They sending help. They will locate us. Transport will arrive within 2 planetary rotations. Patrick stood slowly. So we wait. No, we prepare. For what? For recovery. There will be others, hidden, injured, scattered. They will need shelter. Patrick looked toward the south, where the mountains caught the morning light. Then we rebuild, smarter this time. He adjusted the brace on his leg and started down the stairs, one careful step at a time. Vesh followed. You will require better materials. Yeah, Patrick said. But I've got a few ideas. They disappeared into the broken landscape, one limping, one silent, both moving forward.